biomathematician interested in statistics, data science, functional programming, and other obscure niche topics.
Thank you. Yeah, that's quite accurate. Very great to be back at GPN again. Also, I'm very much amazed by the huge crowd. We just speculated it probably was only due to the cat in the abstract. I was quite surprised to see that so many people care about this topic. So, very quick, who am I? As already mentioned, I'm a biomathematician. I started out as a biologist, actually, so like the plain standing in the lab doing labs things, but I really fell down the math and theory rabbit hole at some point and never managed to escape, I fear. My PhD at the end was basically more math than biology, so like I did math stuff in cancer research, and theoretically I'm a biologist, but I'm really much more of an applied math dude, I guess. And that was, although that was mostly like theory stuff with pencil and paper and proving stuff, I also did a bunch of data analysis in that period of my life. And later I moved into industry, where I still am, and that's basically doing only data science. So I kind of spent quite some time thinking about how to effectively communicate findings to colleagues, but also to maybe non-so-technical folks. And of course, visual communication plays a huge part in that, and that's why I figured I may want to try to condense some learnings from that and provide a little bit of, well, I don't want to say rules because that sounds so authoritative, but it's like some general things I found out that work. And to motivate very briefly this topic, I first want to kind of motivate why exactly we should care about data visualization. And I have two motivating examples. The first one relates to an historical event mid of the 19th century. In Soho, part of London, there was a cholera outbreak. In fact, back during these times, there were lots of cholera outbreaks. So the Soho one was like one small in a sequence of many, many cholera outbreaks. But yeah, this one was very interesting for multiple reasons. I found this picture that showed that it was a pretty dire situation. More than 600 people died. Today, cholera is actually pretty easy to treat, but back then it was pretty terrifying illness. And one dude, one medical doctor by the funny name of John Snow, this guy here, did some very, very cool work and basically founded single-handedly the whole field of epidemiology as we know today while this breakout of cholera was happening. And he did something truly revolutionary back then, and by today's standards it was probably pretty boring idea, but back then it was huge. So he saw like this daily growing list of more and more cases of people, and they lived at different places in Soho and at different occupations, and he wasn't really quite clear or wasn't really able to see a clear pattern. He was like, maybe let's just draw a map. I know, very revolutionary idea, and back then, of course, color printing wasn't so much a thing, so this map that he drew, this is a picture of the original, actually. It was pretty, well, boring because it's black and white. So he took this map from Soho, and every house that was afflicted with a case, he marked with like a black bar. And I guess you can kind of see something already, but I would argue it becomes much clearer if we look at a modern reproduction of this map that was drawn by actually a geography and cartography firm, Merit Cartography in the UK. I wasn't aware that's a thing. Apparently there are companies that do cartography, and they redraw this map. And they use color coding to color code the map. The cases in red, and the map itself is in blue. And I guess already it becomes quite clear, like maybe some of you see it already, there seems to be something happening there, and maybe I guess you all have already a suspicion that right around in the middle, around Broad Street, there are many, many cases, so maybe something is quite literally in the water there. Becomes even more apparent if we look at this map here, that is from a tutorial on some geospatial information system thingy, where they did what's called, the exact term is a kernel density estimate. Basically, they color code every pixel based on how many cases are in the vicinity of that pixel. And you see there's one spot that really quite literally lights up, the yellowish one in the middle, that's directly next to this blue P, which is actually not a parking lot, because parking lots weren't a thing in 1800 something, but in fact it refers to a pump, a water pump, this one here. And as it turns out, around this water pump, the case is clustered. And of course, an argument can be made, hey, there are also some other cases that are much closer to other water pumps. So what our Dr. Snow did is he actually talked to as many people who were afflicted and asked them, hey, actually, where did you get your water from? And the people around other water pumps, they said, yeah, well, I know we have our own pump here, but we actually prefer the taste of the Broad Street water pump, so we always send our children there to fetch us some water, because the Broad Street pump apparently had very tasty water. As it turns out, it was also very unhealthy water, because every person who had cholera had water taken from this very pump. And contrary to a popular version that is often retold, the mayor to whom Jon Snow reported this, he said, okay, I believe this. There's an alternative version of the story where the mayor was like, yeah, no, I don't believe you. And in this alternative version, Jon Snow in the next night secretly snuck to this pump and removed the handle, which you still see is still missing. But no, the mayor he was like, okay, that sounds plausible to me, we should deactivate this pump. And they officially removed the handle, and in this replica of this original pump, which is still, in the original space, you see the handle is still missing, as like allusion to back then. And at this very day, actually, the cholera outbreak in Soho stopped. So apparently that pump was really to blame, and a few months later, they actually found out why. Because only a few meters away from this pump, some month ago, there was like a huge hole where people dumped lots of trash in there. Which, yeah, by today's standards, some people are laughing. It's probably not a smart idea. In fact, what they found in this trash were some used nappies by a baby, or from a baby, who happened to die of cholera. So I guess now it's epidemiologically quite clear what happened. It seeped into the groundwater, and people fetched their children to get water from this lovely Broad Street pump, and then they drank it, and yeah, cholera happens. Okay, so this is, I guess, a nice example of how, like, a simple way of illustrating geographical patterns was able to really, well, not only jumpstart an entire medical field, but also end a quite severe public health problem. Of course, you could argue, well, by just looking at the list of 600 cases, you maybe could have gleaned that Broad Street cropped up a lot or something, but apparently this was kind of necessary, and also apparently it was sufficient to make an end to that. So that's the first example, a real one. The second one is a constructed one by a very famous statistician called Francis Anscombe, who did this in the 70s, so back when computers started to become a thing. And he was very classically trained, so he learned all the statistics stuff with pencil and paper, but he still saw that the emergence of computers is a very cool thing, because it allows you to analyze data. But what he also observed is that many of his colleagues, whenever they were given data, they just stuffed it into the machine and started calculating stuff. So they made tables and lots of numbers fell out, and they didn't really looked at the raw data by making plots or anything, or critically thought about it. They just started to calculate in step 0. And he constructed an example to make clear why this may be a bad idea. And this example, like I said, is completely made up. And it's like a bit theory heavy, but let's just assume just imagine a concrete example. Imagine we are studying the relationship of two variables. Here they're called X and Y. Maybe it could refer to the relationship of the height and the weight of some species of, I don't know, bug in the tropics or whatever. Anyway, they're just called X and Y. And Anscombe constructed a data set that I will show you in a second that fulfills or has a number of these summary statistics. So X and Y have a mean and a variance, obviously. They have a very strong correlation, as you can see. This is, I hope you can see my mouse. No, you cannot. Okay, 1 to 5th row in the table, you see they have a positive correlation of 0.8, which is quite a lot. So if you have a correlation of 1.0, the numbers are on a straight line. 0.8 is pretty close to that. And if you fit a linear model, so like just a simple line in the diagram, a very nice equation pops out, 3 plus 0.5 times x. And this linear regression model explains approximately 2/3 of all the variance in the data set. So this is like something that maybe a typical statistician would start calculating in the day and age of Anscombe without really engaging with the data. And now maybe you can try to imagine how this data set may look like. Maybe some of you have an idea and want to speculate about it. You can speculate as you want, because there's in fact infinitely many correct solutions. So if you maybe have an idea how this data set look, maybe just show and tell me. Yes? Oh, you didn't show hand. Okay. If you're afraid to, then I'll just. Okay. So I guess a typical way you could imagine this data set to look like would be something like this. Oh, where isn't this showing up? Ah, there you are. So like you're following this nice regression line, you have nearly a very, very nice, nearly linear correlation between these two. So I guess this would be a data set that will very nicely fulfill all these aggregate summary statistics. The cool thing now is that this isn't the solution, or rather it's not the only solution, because there's a second one that looks like this. And this is quite obviously completely different, and I think everybody sees and intuitively understands in the first moment you see this, that fitting this linear model, which would spit out the exact same numbers, for such a data set is not really a smart idea, because it's quite clearly not a linear relationship. And in fact, it doesn't stop here, because there's a third solution that fulfills the exact same summary statistics. And as you can see, this is again something completely different, because you have a beautiful, perfectly linear trend and one outlier. So in this case, it might make sense to check back with the data guy what happened at x equals 14, I guess. And probably by now you have guessed it, because there's a hole there, and it's called Anscombe's quartet. There's actually a fourth solution that again completely fulfills up to 3 decimal places exactly these numbers. And that's, of course, again, qualitatively completely different, because in this case we have this one severe outlier on the right, and everything else is completely unrelated, because you have many different values of y for the same value of x. So I guess the take-home message here is very clear. Look at your raw data and start with very simple plots, and most importantly, think if it makes sense to fit such a linear regression model. And even if you have a beautiful correlation coefficient and a beautiful linear regression model that explains a lot of your variance, if you never look at your data, you wouldn't understand that this model only makes sense in the first of these 4 data sets. In the other 3, not at all. So that's the idea that Anscombe wanted to make. And it actually kind of stuck, because by now every introduction to statistics textbook either directly shows this, or at least tells you, like, please always look first at your raw data. But the problem is that many people tend to grab the first chapter of the book and just put it on the side, because they want to start calculating stuff. So that's why I wanted to make this point. Okay, so we observed some things here, I hope, in these examples, which I would like to briefly summarize. So the first thing, and this is this beautiful quote from, I guess, the 19th century, der Mensch ist ein Augentier, with my most beautiful, terrible English accent. It's a pun from German. It doesn't work as nicely in English. Roughly translated means like human is an eye animal. It's often attributed to Goethe, but actually he never said this. But I guess he could have said it because he was very interested in the topic too. But modern research from like neurobiology and psychology actually very much confirms that der Mensch ist ein Augentier, because 90% of all information that end up in our brain are visual in nature. So everything else, all of your other senses combined, only contribute 10% of the information that ends up in your brain. And 50% of everything in our brain, especially on the surface, on the cortex, is directly or indirectly related to processing visual information. And as long as we have our eyes open, 2/3 of all the electrical activity that is happening, 2 to 3 billion firings per second, is related or used for taking care of computing stuff based on visual input. And in fact, the human brain processes images 60,000 times faster than text. And I think we kind of all noticed it when we saw these 4 plots on the right-hand side, because we instantly understood the relationship of these 2 variables, and that they have, qualitatively speaking, a completely different picture than a simple naive linear model. Okay, but apparently some forms of visualization seem to be more effective. That I hope you have also seen when I colored, or when I showed to you the colored version of the Jon Snow map, that it was way easier to instantly see where the action is happening, because the red in front of the light blue-gray background quite literally jumped out at you. So how can we do a good job at speaking this language of the brain and communicating visually statistical patterns in an effective way, or to discover statistical patterns as easily as possible? And I'd like to start with 2 very simple rules of thumb, and they are both very non-technical. They are more of a, to use that terrible verb, mindset thing. And the obligatory disclaimer, this is just my personal opinion, so I don't have any studies to back up that this is in any way the optimal way to do it, but it may just work for you, like just as it worked for me. So the first thing, buzzword alert, simplicity. And with simplicity, I actually mean multiple things. The first thing I mean is, in my opinion, we should always start with the simplest analysis possible. So if we have a complicated data set, look at individual variables first. If the data set is huge, maybe just take a random subset. You can still look at the numbers. Don't just jump right into the really cool, complicated plots because, I mean, yes, they're cool and sexy, but start simple. And if you start simple, you can, as you are looking at the data and become more and more complicated, you can kind of grow your mental model of the data you're looking at. Your understanding grows and you aren't like overwhelming yourself by starting with a huge complicated analysis first. And always try to start with simple kinds of plots. In an ideal case, in my opinion, I'm very strongly convinced that whenever possible, you should always make an attempt to plot the raw data first before you ever use more complicated plots that involve some kind of mathematical machinery to do some kind of abstractions. I will show some examples later. But in my opinion, this is a very good thing because whenever you use more complicated, mathematically involved ways of visualizing, you are, like I said, applying some mathematical machinery, and that tints your vision. It's like a kind of lens you put in front of your eye, or it's a certain angle you look at your raw data, but you are also losing some forms of information. And the second rule of thumb, that's an even more terrible buzzword, but I haven't found a better one, mindfulness. What do I mean with this terrible word? Well, not meaning meditating, but what I mean is you should be aware that whenever you make a plot, whatever kind of plot, this plot can tell you something very specific. It can make one point, and you should be aware of what it is that you're trying to discover when you make this plot. So some people, when they think of statistical analysis, they just, I don't know, they load the data set in Excel and make all plots they can find, and then they throw them together, and they have like a 50-page PDF document with many, many plots, and they're all called X over Y, or like, I don't know, blood pressure over patient group stratified by whatever. And that's all nice and fine. But I think it is very much worth it to be aware of why you're making a specific plot. What kind of question are you implicitly asking the data, or what are you trying to see? And every choice you're making for that plot follows directly from this question, because if you have a specific question in mind, then you will instantly recognize if some element of that plot are not helpful for that. In fact, you can and should eliminate everything from the plot that is not related to this very question. It's usually called a chart junk. So everything that maybe just like looks nice and whimsical, little cutesy pictures or whatever, you can do that, but it will probably detract you or overwhelm your audience. So keep it simple, be mindful of that. And this is something I think that's very helpful. You are aware of what a specific plot can tell you, but the next question you should always be aware of is what the specific plot is not able to tell you. Because every plot you do is a specific angle of viewing your data, and no plot can tell you everything that happens. And by being aware of what a plot cannot do, quite often you'll instantly get a clear idea of what a suitable next plot to do may be. Because if you think, well, this plot tells me X and Y, but it cannot tell me Z or whatever, then you kind of instantly understand, hey, maybe looking at Z would make sense, or it always offers you possibility to continue this analysis. And to hopefully convince you that these two simple and rather non-technical rules are helpful, I'd like to start with a very simple data set called IRIS data set. It's a very old one from the 30s by a very famous statistician, Ronald Fisher he's called, and relates to these 3 species of quite beautiful flowers from the genus Iris. There are 3 different kinds. I think there are even more species. I don't know. I'm just a biologist, so. And yeah, you see, I did cancer research. I did not do botany research because I never really quite cared. But there are at least these 3 different species, and Ronald Fisher asked some guy, hey, measure 50 of each because I need a cute data set for a paper I'm writing. And this data set has become a kind of staple that you always see it whenever you're seeing the documentation of a plotting library, or when new plots are invented, they'll always use either the IRIS one or one of the other 5 standard data sets. And like I said, 3 times 50 entries, and 50 entries per species. And what Ronald Fisher asked his biologists to do is measure 4 things for every entry. So the sepal and the petal, which are like different kinds of leaves. The sepals are the big ones below, and the petals are the one right up close to where the pollen is. And for each of these 2 kinds of leaves, the length and the width were measured. So we have 4 quantitative measurements for every entry. And like I said, 50 entries per each of these 3 species. And one of the many, many possible things we could ask this data set now is it possible based on these measurements alone to identify the species a leaf may be coming from? So like I said, we should be aware of what we're trying to do. And it's also a nice exercise to think what else this data set could tell you. And if you brainstorm a bit, you will find there are many, many different other cool things you could do with this data set, but this is like the cliche one that everybody does, so we will do that. And like I said, we start simple by considering only one variable at a time and trying to be as close to the raw data as possible. The nice thing is, with 3 times 50 data points, which is rather small, you can still plot them all individually without like running into issues. So we start with one variable, why not with the length of the sepal, and we plot all the raw data of the 3 times 50, the sepal length for these 3 species. And as you can see, well, there seems to be quite some signal in there. One of the species, the setosa one, seems to be the smallest, then the versicolor, and then the virginica one. But there's still quite a lot of overlap. So based on this one measure, of this one feature, you wouldn't really be able to tell the 3 species apart. Then we increase a bit our complexity, look at the second variable, the width of the sepal. You see, quite interestingly, and I don't really know why, a different trend. In this case, the setosa one seems to have the largest. I'm not sure what evolutionary reasons might there behind. Probably a botanist might be able to tell you. But relating to our main question, apparently this variable also seems to be the really suitable choice. Okay, so we continue with the petals, and then we see, we're getting someplace. The setosa one really is doing its own thing. The other 2, there's a bit of overlap, but there seems to be a very strong signal. And the same picture emerges if we look at the last column, the petal width. We see the same thing. Setosa doing its own thing. The other 2, strong signal, but a bit of overlap. So still not 100% way of telling all these apart. But some variables seem to have a stronger signal. So an obvious question that I said is, which things are these plots not able to tell us? Maybe somebody has an idea and wants to take a wild guess. If not, it's also not a problem. I will tell you in a second. Yes?
Like area of the
Yes, that's a good point. What you could do is you could make up your own columns to calculate the area of the leaves. I think that's a very interesting idea, actually, that probably makes a lot of sense from a biological point of view. I haven't done this here, but this would be a very interesting question to ask. Yes. Any other ideas, maybe? Yes?
Can I differentiate this information?
Right, you can. Right, exactly, because you can only based on one. I think you're trying to say that based on one of these 4 features alone, you cannot really. But maybe if you like look at multiple ones at the same time, exactly. Yeah, that's exactly the question, the answer I was aiming for. What happens in higher dimension if we consider multiple variables at a time? And that's exactly my point. In 2D, if we consider 2 variables at a time, some more patterns emerge. And maybe let's just start with the sepals, because why not? What we see by looking at sepal length and width, setosa again doing its own thing, the other 2 being really intermingled. So it's not really perfect, but we can still make another point with that plot, because you see I had to encode the species, this categorical variable, with, well, in this case, color. But it would have been imaginable to instead use different forms of markers, so dots, crosses, and squares. Or maybe using the same symbol but different sizes. And what I'm trying to convince you here is, I think you will all hopefully see that there's one obvious way that works best and 2 ways that do not work really as nicely. So I hope we all agree that the way of visualizing with the color is a good choice. The way with different symbols, well, it might have its place in like black and white papers. Some journals still print in black and white. I don't know why, but it's a thing. And the last example that we use different sizes doesn't really work that well, and I think it also biases our attention to the setosa. To me, it suggests that the setosa one is in some way, shape, or form somewhat bigger or larger in some continuous trait than the other 2, which is, of course, roughly misleading, because these 3 are just 3 different categories. There's like no natural order on them. And altogether, well, the sepals don't seem to carry all too much information. As I said, some ways of encoding that, in particular color, seem to be easier to grasp for us, and some things are kind of misleading. And like I said, the size seems to me suggest that there's some form of continuous trait. Okay, maybe let's next look at the petals, so the other 2 columns. That was the 2 ones on the right where we saw some action happening. And as it turns out, and this is like the textbook solution, yes, if you look at the petals and plot them, then you see there's a very nice way of drawing 2 lines that will allow you to nearly 100% separate these three species. There's a tiny region of overlap between versicolor and virginica, but it's really a tiny bit of overlap only. So with these two traits, you have a very good chance of telling the three species apart. And interesting thing that emerges by just looking at raw data, there's a very clean correlation that's consistent across these species. I actually don't know why. Maybe there's like some evolutionary pressure behind it. Maybe a botanist may tell you. But hey, we randomly discovered something else here. What, however, do we still need to look at maybe? There's something we're still missing. Maybe somebody has an idea. Okay, doesn't seem to, I think. Don't see anybody. Oh, yes.
It looks like there's a flower missing.
There's a flower missing. Oh, actually, yes, that's a good question. I actually don't know. Maybe there is yet another iris species that... Yes, I get your point. There is a part missing, and from like an evolutionary perspective, this could correspond to an ecological niche where another species could establish itself. I don't know. Maybe there's yet another iris species that's just not part of the data set. Very good question. What I was actually going for, it's a much boring answer, is there's still 4 plots remaining that we should plot, namely when we plot one of the 2 sepal traits against one of the 2 petal traits. And we kind of see, well, there isn't really a strong correlation between this. Why? I guess there's yet another biological reason, maybe because the plant says, well, what I'm doing up here doesn't really affect what I'm doing down there, so maybe that's why there's no relationship. And the fact that we had 4 variables required us to now look at 6 plots already. So the more columns we have, the kind of worse it becomes. Some things we have just observed, like I said, we have made this distinction between categorical and continuous variables, species being the categorical one, and they seem to work best with different kinds of visual cues. So as I've said, when we took the size, this always biased my brain into thinking, hey, this looks kind of like there's some order, some continuous trait. And actually there's psychological research on which choices are the best for the human brain to grasp. We'll take a look at it in a second. And the second thing I've just said, the more variables you have, the more tedious it becomes to inspect everything. But there's also ways around it. So first, let's look at psychology. And these 2 guys, Cleveland and McGill, in the midst of the 80s, have done a very extensive study on all forms or ways you can visualize continuous variables, so numbers like sepal width, and studied in randomly taken people how well they are able to measure or to judge by visually looking at these plots differences between different data points as accurately as possible. And they come up with this very famous textbook depiction by now that tells you, well, the best thing to rank visual differences is by doing something at a common scale. So if you have like a horizontal line where you mark different points, then it's very easy to tell these apart, or by having the typical bar chart we all know and love, based on like a common 0, then it's really easy to see, well, the first one is the smallest, second one is the largest, third one kind of in between. If you don't have a common 0 line and just look at the length, it becomes already quite hard to really accurately say which one is the largest. I'm not quite sure. I think the first one is the smallest, then the second to the last one, then probably second, third, and last one. And it really becomes actually quite bad when you're dealing with angles. Sorry. That's actually the reason why pie charts are bad, TM. So don't use pie charts because it's really hard to accurately tell how many degrees something is. We are simply evolutionarily not wired to accurately tell apart different angles. And what's even worse is areas and volumes. So when you see like suit and tie people using the standard PowerPoint visualization of like taking different size cubes, that's utterly terrible. Because these charts really are hugely misleading, because like the middle and the third one, they look very, very similar, but there's actually quite some numerical difference because volume scales in the 3rd dimension. And the human brain is better at telling apart things in 1 dimension, not in 3. And color saturation is also really, really bad. It can work if you use very stark differences, but if you have a continuous scale, it's very hard to tell apart gray 83% from gray 87%. And similar with colors or hue color, it can work if you have like green and a cyan and a blue to denote maybe different categories. But if you really want to tell apart the second and the third and the fourth one, for instance, and you have many, many data points with many, many oh so tinily different hue colors, it becomes bad. So this is not a good thing to visualize continuous variables. However, colors, as you've seen, are really good for categorical ones. In fact, the human brain is really hardwired to easily perceive stark color difference. We have seen that when we saw the recolored map by Jon Snow. There are some rules for that, so you should use it sparingly. You should not use it just because you like it, because in the first case, where you color every bar differently, it's useless. And I wonder, hey, what do these colors mean? Do they have any meaning that's maybe relating to other plots? Well, no, the person apparently just loved using colors. Like I said, for continuous variables, please don't use these because it's super hard to accurately tell these 4 shades apart. And if you use colors, because they are so powerful, please use them consistently to always refer to the same thing within your, I don't know, slide deck or publication or whatever. Don't just switch it around because color is so powerful, it will confuse people. And if you have some form of implicit ordering, like small, medium, large, you can kind of use hues, but if there's no ordering suggested, like for instance, iris versicolor, virginica, or setosa, please use colors that are really far apart, like I did with blue and orange and green. Okay, the second to the last thing refers to what I've already mentioned. It's usually called the curse of dimensionality. When you have more and more dimensions or more colors, the number of plots you could theoretically make, it blows up following some factorial relationship. With 4, we already had like, I think it was, 6 different ones. If you have 5, it's already 10 plots you could make, and so on and so forth. So there are some, I guess, first ideas you could come up with how to deal with that, and you will have to deal with it at some point, because what I did in cancer research, for instance, was looking at transcriptomic data where we measure 30,000 genes in every cell. So the table had 30,000 columns and like a few thousand individual cells. So that's something you cannot just look at it. So some first ideas may be pre-selecting only those columns that, based on univariate plots, the first kind of plots we made, seem to carry lots of information. That can work, but you can overlook stuff that is happening in higher dimensions. So this means this comes kind of with the implicit hope that the ones that have the best signal in 1D also carry some meaning in higher dimensions, which often is the case, but often not. Another idea is if you see that 2 columns are really, really strongly correlated, like with a correlation coefficient of like, I don't know, 0.95, and that also happens quite often, you could argue, well, they're basically carrying the same kind of information. So you could just drop one of them, because you don't really learn anything by looking at 2 times the factor of the same thing. We'll see an example of that very soon. You can, and people more and more do that today, say, well, we have a huge, complicated data set with many nonlinear stuff happening. Can we just throw some machine learning model on it, like random forest or whatever, because these models can figure out many complicated nonlinear things? So I don't want to badmouth that. It's, in fact, a very smart thing to do, in fact. But my point is, clever visualizations can also work quite well. So you don't always need to jump through this heavy machinery. And to visualize, or to make across this point, I'll have a look at the classic diamonds data set. The funny thing about this, I wasn't really able to figure out who assembled that data set in the first place. Always like, yeah, it was first made for the R programming language in the ggplot library. And what I was able to find is somebody sourced these data from the Lose diamond search engine, which apparently is a thing. There's search engines for diamonds. I wasn't aware. But some poor fella assembled this data set with prices for diamonds for like 54,000 different diamonds, the prices of them, and a bunch of other variables, like the carat. It's like the one thing we probably all think of when we think diamonds, like how much does it weigh? The quality of the cut, so like there's apparently more beautiful cuts of diamonds and more ugly ones. Color, if there's like a lot of junk in the diamond, it looks kind of shitty and then people will pay less. Clarity, same thing. Oh no, that was actually clarity. Color is like if it's like transparent as water, or if they're like a yellow hue or whatever, and a bunch of other stuff, some derived numbers I don't quite understand. The price, that's what we care about, of course, and the length, width, and depth. So this data set looks like so. It's, like I said, it has many, many entries, already has some columns, so it's kind of hard to bring meaning into that. And again, we could produce all kinds of pair plots. We could maybe try to even do like 3D plots to try to predict the price. Or we can do something else. And this is actually something, was like a running gag with my professor. Whenever I was stuck with these huge data sets, he always like, hey, have you considered making a heat map? And I was like, no, I have not. Let's try this. And it tended to work. So my prof was onto something. This heat map is indeed a nice map of the data set. So one thing I did here, I just brought all these columns on the same scale. So we have like 0 to 1, minimum to maximum. And we sorted this thing by the price. So you see the price column is beautifully ordered. And we can just look at this whole data set at one glance. And we see some interesting things. So what we see is the caret column on the very left seems to have a pretty similar pattern to the price. Not perfectly beautiful, but seems to go into the kind of same direction, which I guess makes sense. If the diamond weighs more, people will pay more. Makes sense. Same thing seems to apply to the three measurements, X, Y, Z, which again also makes sense based on like first principles from physics. If the thing is larger, it will weigh more. Makes sense. And I guess it also makes sense that I guess nobody wants a diamond that's like super thin and really long. So I guess the three measurements also will kind of be correlated with each other. The other stuff, quite confusingly, don't seem to show a clear relationship. So it's not that the diamonds with the best cut or color or clarity all consistently yield a high price. It seems to be, in fact, quite all over the place. We'll understand in a few seconds why exactly. But first, I just said that price and karat and also XYZ, they all seem to be kind of strongly correlated with each other, which makes sense. Like I said, cut, color, clarity, not so much. But I guess we kind of all have this intuitive understanding that if you're in your diamond that you may want to buy if you're rich, if there's like lots of junk in it, you probably don't want to have it. So you probably only play a smaller price. So what exactly are we missing here? That's also the stuff I mentioned. Like if we have, oh yeah, that's one thing to notice. Imagine if we had like some kind of human gene expression data set with 30,000 columns. You could make a heat map, but it would be harder to look at the individual columns again. So this would be a case where I say, hey, it's fair to involve some more mathematical machinery. Hey, you want to maybe try to exclude some genes before that you see don't vary as much at all because probably they aren't really interesting and stuff. But for this case, we're still in a situation where we can comfortably look at the whole heat map with pretty much one glance. And for those cases where you have like 30,000 genes, something you can do is not make a heat map of the raw samples. Oh, why is there an R? Oh, because I added it later, because I missed it in the plotting software. Yeah, this R, I added it. You see, I made some last-minute edits. In fact, the last slides I added like 20 minutes before the talk started. So you will see when the quality drops. The point here is, this is a heat map of correlation coefficients. And you can kind of see what we just visually already saw on the heat map. XYZ, price, and karat, they're all very, very strongly positively related with each other. One thing you also see is we use a different heat map now, which is like white, gray in the middle. It's red to the top, blue to the bottom. Anybody want to take a wild guess why we're now using a different heat map? Do you like have any intuitive reason why it would make sense to use this kind of heat map here? Yes?
To make negatives more obvious.
Exactly, to make negative more obvious, or to like be us able to tell apart when something is positively correlated versus negative. There's, so to say, a natural breakpoint at exactly 0, because 0 means two things aren't related at all. It's like just a huge point cloud. And the smaller the value gets, the clearer the trend becomes, but it is negative. One goes up, the other one goes down. So this is called a diverging color map, in fact. And here is a reason, because there's like a natural midpoint. And the correlation coefficients very much confirm what we saw, that these 5 guys, they are correlated strongly with each other, and the other things not so much, which is still the open question we want to answer. One last addition to this topic of the heat map of the correlation is you can also, you can kind of see by looking at it, the 4 on the right and the left one, they're all positively correlated, but you can also tell the computer, hey, can you like try to group all things that are in such a tight cluster of being correlated into one place, so it's more obvious for me to tell. It's usually called a cluster map. It just tries to cluster stuff that's correlated. There is this me being this whiny nagging guy saying, well, yes, but there's some mathematical machinery behind that, so please make sure you know what you're doing, because this can be kind of misleading. So if you do things like that, try to read the docs and try to understand what the thing is doing and like the assumption it comes with. But then the computer can indeed tell you, yes, I'll group these 5 things into one cluster. You see, they are very, very strongly correlated all with each other. And the other stuff is like, yeah, all kind of, well, not really showing any strong signal. However, like I said, the question is still open. Why is there not really a strong correlation of these things like cut and color? And to make a very, very long story very short, The fact is that these three variables, they're just secondary factors. So what I did is I plotted price over weight, carat, because we saw these two things are very strongly related. So I first plotted them and I was wondering, is this relationship like modulated or affected by these secondary factors? And in fact, you see it very much is, especially in the plot on the right, you see when the clarity goes up, this is indicated by these darker points, then the price will be consistently higher for the same weight, which, like I said, it totally makes sense. If you have like two diamonds that have the same size, but one of them is much more beautiful to look at, well, I'm obviously willing to pay much more for this one. Also, what I found really funny to look at is another one of these cool things that just pop out only if you look at the raw data. There is this super sharp increase directly at exactly 1 carat. So you see before prices are lower, and the moment you're at 1, prices instantly jump up a lot. That's in fact just like very good marketing and marketing psychology happening, because many people say, well, if you give me a marriage ring, I want at least 1 carat because I am worth that. And like jeweler people and stuff, they kind of play into that and said, well, you certainly want to buy your girlfriend a 1 carat ring, don't you? And people usually follow that manipulation, so they're willing to pay the price for that. And last topic I want to stress real quick here is, it's the second to the last. Heat maps are also nice for time series data. Of course, until now, our data sets, they were all very static. So they were measured once, and then we had them, we could play around with them. But many real-world data, of course, changes over time. In fact, I would say the most interesting stuff is that the things that change over time. There is another data set, another famous one from the 70s, from these guys, Box, Jenkins, Rainsel. Box, famous statistician actually. They assembled the number of airline passengers in the US over months and years. And if you just plot the number, it looks like that. So you see there's some interesting trend happening. It always goes up, down, but the overall trend is an upward slope. And I guess you can kind of already assume why exactly this may be happening. But if you split this one dimension, this one time dimension, artificially into 2 dimensions, so like artificially increasing the number of dimensions by plotting years in rows and months in column, then you can see, interesting, during the summer month, this trend really seems to ramp up a lot, which I would say makes a lot of sense because people want to make their summer holidays. And of course, this data set will not tell you, well, is there maybe a trend within a day? I guess more people will fly in the morning or like in the afternoon or something as opposed to at like 2 a.m. in the night. So you can make this analysis arbitrarily more involved if you wonder what else these things could be telling you. July and August, like I said, seem to dominate. Something I wanted to ask to maybe see if you paid attention to the previous plot. Is there any particular design choice in this plot, which I have stolen from the internet actually, from a Medium article? Any design choice in this heat map that you would disagree with? Yes?
2 different colors here.
Yes, exactly. We have a diverging heat map, and it completely doesn't make sense at all, because why the hell would there be a natural midpoint at 360-ish? It doesn't make sense. So I think the allure of this is that this plot kind of overemphasized the mid-region because it pops out as a gray. So this looks like a diagram where lots of stuff is happening and is really ramping up. So this is a nice plot to look at, but it's completely misleading. You want to have, like, in this case, definitely a continuous color map that goes from like one color to another one and like kind of uniformly increases. You don't want to have like this V-shaped kind of stuff. And yes, I would very much say continuous scale is more appropriate. This is another plot I stole from somebody else because I didn't have time to make it myself. But in this way, you have like this continuous one going from light yellow to dark blue, and then you can still see there's some mid-region stuff happening. You also see something in the 12th month. There's also something that kind of just now becomes apparent. But again, I guess that makes sense because in December, many people want to fly home or meet their families. Things we cannot see, of course, trends within weeks, within days, stuff like that. Does the ratio actually between months stay consistent, or do these months, July and August, maybe become more and more important compared to the other ones? We could look into that. And the last thing, and then I'm nearly done, and these are the slides where the quality suddenly drops because I made them in front of the door. I just wanted to give a very quick outlook because I was earlier thinking, hey, it's like chaos, patterns and chaos, and I was reminded of so-called chaotic systems, which is a thing from math. This is a very famous chaotic system. It's 3 coupled differential equations. Not really important what that means. I will at some point give a talk on differential equation modeling because that's basically my day job and it's very cool. But the point here is there's 3 equations that describe how a system in 3 dimensions is evolving. There's no like closed form solution, so you have to always numerically simulate it, for instance, like weather data or something. And if you plot this in 3D, it looks like this. Many people probably have seen this. This is like one of those typical nice illustrations people show when it's about chaotic systems. And the idea or the whole stick of a chaotic system is that if you change the starting condition a tiny little bit, then over time, this tiny bit will exponentially ramp up, and at the end you have a completely different outcome in your system. So if we started a tiny little bit to the left compared to this one, we would get a completely different, I mean, it would be similar, but the trajectories would be at completely different places. So that's the famous butterfly effect. The idea is that if a butterfly somewhere makes a little tiny bit of air pressure by flapping its wings, then in a chaotic system, like the climate system is, in theory, this could very well blow up over time and at some point cause a hurricane at the other end of the globe. If you plot these 3 values, x, y, z, over time, you see it's indeed quite chaotic. Goes up, goes down. We cannot really forecast. We have to numerically simulate this. The interesting idea, and this is counterintuitively only works with these chaotic systems that are all over the place. It doesn't work with nice systems. The idea is, let's imagine from this 3D system, we only have measurements for one of the 3 coordinates. So imagine we only have the x-axis, and the other 2 we do not have. And like I said, we aren't able to derive an analytical closed form solution to that. So if we only had one coordinate, the x one, the first plot, the intuition would be we're kind of lost. We cannot really understand what is happening. But the thing is, we can now use this trick I mentioned earlier from the heat map by artificially making up more dimensions. As we have seen earlier, we just splitted the 1D time axis into months and years. And we can do the same thing if you take this 1D time series and make up more coordinates as you go along by plotting x, then on another axis, x plus some fixed amount of time, maybe like 1 unit. And on yet another axis, you plot x plus maybe 2 amounts of units. So this is called a delay embedding. The idea is you have only one time series, but you plot the time series kind of against itself, just shift it a tiny little bit. You can, of course, freely choose what delay you want, and depending on that, what you see in the delay embedding based on only one of the 3 coordinates is sometimes a pattern that's strikingly similar to the 3D thing. So you can reconstruct this by taking only one of these 3 dimensions and still kind of get back to this original shape, solely based on this trick of splitting your one-dimensional time axis into more axes. And the very cool thing is, if you find the optimal value, what pops out is very, very close to the original thing. Like I said, this is like very, very hastily added. I just wanted to mention that you can try to play around with the dimensionality or making up more dimensions is a very nice thing. And this is actually referring to something that somebody earlier said. We could make another feature in the iris data set referring to the area of the leaf. So you are free to make up more dimensions, and sometimes that can very much help. Like I said, it's a bit of an outlook. I will probably give a more focused talk on this topic at some point. I just wanted to tease a bit. And in conclusion, like I said, this is the one take-home message der Mensch ist ein Augentier. And I used a silly accent because hopefully you will remember it then better. My first rule of thumb is start simple, make the really simple stuff. The more complicated stuff has its place, but use it mindfully. Like I said, data can be continuous or categorical ones. Choose your visualization accordingly. There is psychological research on that. You can do it right. You can do it in a kind of evil, misleading way. And you can also just do it in a very bad way. For instance, if you use like these cube PowerPoint chart thingies, so please do not do that. And be mindful of a plot is able to tell you, but also if it's, because then you can like try to focus your plot on that message, eliminate everything else, but also always keep in mind what it cannot do. Because if you understand this plot cannot tell me this and that, then you'll always get like an obvious follow-up question. In this way, you get in this mindset of like having a kind of dialogue with your data. It's like trying to get to know a new person. You start simple, you talk about simple stuff, you wonder, hey, that sounds interesting, I want to learn more about that, and then you can go into a certain direction that you think is an interesting follow-up question. In this kind of dialogue, I would say, you're naturally becoming, like flowing into that mindset of how to distill stuff or insights from an even complicated data set. With that, I'm done. thank you very much for attention and for being so here numerously. Questions are always welcome. You can hit me up on Telegram. I'm from the furry fandom. That's why I'm on Telegram. I'm still not member of ISIS. Also have a Matrix account. I sometimes look into it, actually. Sometimes I even understand how to use it. Of course, in person and at some events, not this one because it's too warm, but again at Congress, I'll also roam around like this. So if you see this fluffy guy, please also feel free to hit him up. He will be most delighted. You see, I copy-pasted the slide. This is not Nuke, so please ignore that link. There's no feedback at Nuke Lübeck anymore. But thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Yote, for this wonderful talk showing us hidden patterns in the chaos. Are there any questions? We still have about 10 minutes,
yes.
So, okay. I'm gonna come to you. You are, I think, you were first.
How do you decide when you are done? Because when you showed the iris data set, you've only plotted it in 2 dimensions, and I thought it would be maybe a good idea to plot it in 3 dimensions, which you only did at the end with the chaotic systems.
Yes.
How do you decide when you're done and what you are trying next?
That is a very, very good question. If you're in industry, usually your boss will tell you when you're done, because at the moment when the question is answered, then you can always be like, hey, but it would be cool to also... No, I don't care. We have answered the question. Move on. So that's the sad reality. If you're doing it as a hobby for yourself, I mean, there's no strict answer. Of course, you hopefully also have a question. If you feel that the question is sufficiently well answered and you kind of stop losing interest and think you have taken account of everything that you think is relevant, then you can stop. I really like the fact that you instantly thought of, hey, what could we do else? Because that's very nice mentality. And yeah, very right. You could have also looked at 3D-dimensional plots. 4D plots kind of become hard because it's not really possible to like visualize them. But yeah, as always, there's no clear-cut answer. And usually when I do this privately, I kind of stop when I think, okay, it's kind of enough now. I have really clear answers, and I kind of stop caring about that. And then it's time to move on to something else. And in this case, of course, we kind of fulfilled our objective because we saw we were able to tell apart the 3 species. So at this point, you could also be like, okay, good enough is good enough.
I have a very correlated question, I suppose. I was also wondering why like 3D visualizations seem to be like such an atypical thing, because you were mentioning the curse of dimensionality. It seems to be very worthwhile to have like just that one extra dimension to like
yes,
get that. Yeah.
I do agree with you on one hand. On the other hand, the problem with 3D is unless you're building like a physical 3D model with like woods and sticks, you can, which was done actually in some 50s paper in Science. Some researcher, because there weren't any 3D plotting packages, she actually built a 3D diagram with woods and sticks and stuff, and just submitted a photo of that. But yes, today you can do 3D plots, but you can always show them only on paper. So what you're doing is you're projecting a 3D picture back into 2D space on a like piece of paper, and that can be kind of hard to read because you have to work really hard to make clear which point is where in the 3D space. What you can do now that we aren't really bound to paper journals anymore, more to like websites or whatever, you can of course always make like these rotating things that you can also freely rotate. And I think this is something that is gaining traction. People are doing more and more of that, which is a good thing. But it's, like I said, generally due to like practical constraints of being in a 2D paper space.
I was thinking of it more as like an exploratory tool, because like when you're initially trying to figure out which dimensions are
yes,
relevant.
certainly. I mean, I could have shown some like 3D rotating stuff, but that would be quite a lot of work to do it here. But I mean, I actually should look into that for the next iteration of the talk now. Thank you.
When does become a simplification a lie? Because in the end, we have super complex scenarios with data sets, and then we have to gain a certain knowledge out of them, but it's not true for every of these points. So we could say, okay, they may be an outlier from a kind of measurement perspective, but oftentimes we also have to simplify, otherwise we cannot operate with knowledge.
Absolutely.
Do you have a rule of thumb? How do you know it's too simple or where you should gain with that?
The point is very much true. Every time we are doing an analysis, we are, of course, moving away from the messy real world and try to find like some kind of model or explanation that simplifies the whole thing into like an easy take-home message. And the question of what is signal versus what is outlier is actually something that's one of those things where a statistician will always answer to you with a, well, it depends on what you want to do. The problem is, I think the only real way of being able to tell apart a true signal from an outlier is not statistics or math, but domain knowledge of the system you're studying. So if you understand the model system of iris flowers, or if you understand airline travel, then you are able as a domain expert to say, well, this one uptick in that curve is biologically or from an like airline corporation perspective not interesting for us and we can safely exclude it. But based on statistics alone, you cannot make that judgment call. Although many people think they can, but I disagree with that. So domain knowledge always has a place in data analysis.
Do you have some tips to increase accessibility for plots?
Very much.
Because in the iris data set, I was not able to distinguish two of the flowers because the green and the orange was, I could not.
Yes, interesting. You have some form of color. Yes, interesting. Yeah, it's very good that you mentioned it, because first I actually wasn't aware that the standard color cycle in Python of blue, orange, green is apparently not good for some forms of visual impairment. It's good to know. I do know there is research available and color maps available in most plotting packages now that are optimized with certain ways of visual color impairments in mind, or optimized for being still able to be perceived. So that's a thing. There are, like I mentioned, there are color maps based on studies by people who know the stuff and are optimized to be like understandable for as many people as possible. So yeah, that's a good remark actually.
Do terrible infographics cause you physical pain?
Honestly, sometimes yes. Especially, I mean, the thing is like with it depends on your audience. So when I see one of these nice infographics that come with lots of cutesy illustrations and many clip arts and stuff, then I don't like it, because I'm the kind of more rational person. Just show me the data, and if the data speaks, please don't interrupt. But I can like kind of control my blood pressure when I understand that this is not something that's made for me, but more for like a lay audience that wants to have an easier time accessing this information, and that maybe prefers like this a bit more cutesy illustrative style or something. But I personally, I mean, my blood pressure is still okay. I don't have to take any meds yet, so I manage.
Yeah, regarding the accessibility thing, one thing that my professor suggested me when I was doing my PhD was to use both colors and symbols. Mm-hmm. So that it's nice color thing that you see, but also that you have the symbol. So you, especially if you want to have a nice look, nicely looking PDF, but it should also look nice once it's printed in black and white.
Yes.
So
that's a very good point, actually. When I submitted, I think, one of my first papers, I was still told, well, yes, please be aware that the color version is only available online, and if people have like the physical paper, or like have a subscription to the journal, it will only be black and white. And I was like, not so many years ago, and I was like, hey, we're in 2018, 19 or whatever. No, it was earlier even. It's like, hey, you guys can do color print, or you just want to save money. But yeah, I was encouraged to also do exactly that, also use different symbols, which I did. And that is, of course, a safe way if you don't really understand how to design plots for an audience with visual impairments. But like I said, the research on that has ramped up, and there are like, so to say, easy to use, or like batteries included color maps that are optimized for this. So you don't really have to worry all that much by yourself. You can kind of trust these people to have optimized it. But sure, symbols are always also a good alternative, yes.
We've got time for another short question.
So in some contexts, tree maps are very popular, and that's a form of area mapping, right? So like xdirstat, for example, will give you your disk space in the form of big area plots. Is this just psychologically wrong, in your opinion, or is there still some place for it? Is there a reason that this is really a common type of plot for this?
The reason why for disk space they choose it is actually because it's like it's complete speculation, but I think it was this back when a hard drive was a real hard drive, of course the stuff was a circle. So I think my suspicion is when they first designed that was actually what they were thinking of. And then I just said, well, that seems kind of suitable. I would argue, and some like partitioning software seem to agree with me, that you can and should instead also use like a simple bar chart 100% where you have like different lines and colors, because that is proven to be easier to parse for a human brain. So in my opinion, there should be no place for that in 2025.
Our time is at an end. Thanks again, Yote.
Thank you, everybody.
Talk. Yeah, and a big applause.
Thank you.